Well, hello, I'm Mark Edo, your moderator. Let me begin by wishing you all a happy Earth Day. Today marks the 51st anniversary of the annual celebration around the world to pledge support for environmental protection. This year's theme for Earth Day is Restore Our Earth. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has said that recovery from COVID-19 is a chance to set the world on a cleaner, greener, more sustainable path. Mother Earth is clearly urging a call to action. This year's Earth Day focuses on natural processes, emerging green technologies, and innovative thinking that can restore the world's ecosystems. So it's very appropriate that today we're having this high-level event with the theme Scaling Up Green Energy Investments in Crisis Setting. This is part of UNDP's series of development dialogues that focus on crisis and fragility from a people-centered perspective. It's a 90-minute interactive session, which will be in 3 parts. We'll start with an opening panel session, then we'll go to a second panel, and then we'll round up with closing statements from a key UNDP voice. I strongly encourage you to log into YouTube and type in your questions or your thoughts on topics for today in the comment section. Remember, you can include your name, your title, and your location. And if you can, tell us who your question is directed at. I'll endeavor to pose as many questions to the speakers as we have time for. Now, if a state is deemed fragile, it greatly increases the chances of that nation lacking access to electricity. In fact, we know that nations exposed to conflict, extreme poverty, or poor governance have the lowest access to energy, especially renewable energy. 90% of the about 800 million people on the planet who have little or no electricity live in conflict-affected countries. So it's no surprise that greatly impacts social and economic growth. Electricity adds massive value to modern life, from having light at night to washing clothes to cooking meals, running machinery, or just connecting people across the world. Many would argue that it is a crucial element for poverty alleviation, economic growth, and improved living standards. That's why on the 24th of February, 2021, the G7 Plus, together with its development partners, launched a call to action to urge aid agencies, governments, and businesses to work together to end energy poverty in conflict-affected countries. Today's event brings together representatives from the G7 Plus and from governments, donors, and UNDP to share their experiences and views from the ground on what we need to do together to make ending energy poverty a reality. So let's begin with our first session, which asks the simple but important question: why does green energy matter in fragile context? We have 2 speakers for this session. The G7 Plus, the intergovernmental group that brings together 20 countries affected by conflict, was created with the belief that a new development architecture and a new way of working, better tailored to the challenges of fragile contexts, are necessary to build peaceful states and society. So we're delighted to welcome the General Secretary of the G7 Secretariat, Mr. Helder da Costa. Our second panelist is a development champion too. She was the first Deputy Secretary General of Yemen's National Dialogue Council, and she's got more than 10 years of experience in development. She's contributed greatly to the conflict reduction and women's empowerment programs, and she's currently the humanitarian affairs advisor to the Prime Minister of Yemen. That's Miss Afra Al-Zuba. So welcome to you both. I'm going to give both of you 5 minutes to articulate your thoughts on green energy matters in a fragile context. I'll start with you, Mr. Da Costa. This is a very powerful rallying call from the G7 Plus at a time when COVID-19 pandemic is increasing the challenges faced by fragile states. As you answer the question, could you touch on why it's such a priority to scale up energy investments in fragile states? And how do you think it can really be achieved? Go ahead, sir.
Thank you, Mark. First of all, I'd like to thank UNDP for inviting the G7 Plus to be on this important panel to discuss about the scaling up the energy investment in fragile states. On behalf of the G7 Plus Secretariat and its member states, which some of us are represented here today, I'd like to say this. that why green energy matters in fragile and conflict-affected states. As eloquently said by Mark, that 90% of the poorest are living in fragile states. And yet, many countries are still lacking energy sources to supply their daily life. Can you imagine this COVID situation with no electricity, with dark hospitals? How can we promote the vaccination if there is no cold storage without the electricity supply? Yeah? So that just simply illustrates the need, the imperative need to have green energy in fragile states. And it couldn't come in a better time. That's why on the 24th of February this year, together with the members of the Council of State Fragility, we, the G7 Plus, launched a call to action for donors, national governments, private sector, business people, academia, and think tanks in order to scale up the investment in fragile states in terms of green energy. So former and current presidents, they all sign up in order to be able to promote this call to action, in order to highlight the need to have energy source for fragile people in conflict-affected states. As you know, wars leave behind a legacy of devastated infrastructure, weak institutions, and fragile economies. Now it is time for us, those who are living in fragile states, to reach out to our donors, to our multilateral institutions, to the governments in the developed world, to come and invest in energy supply to our countries.
Thank you there, Mr. Helder da Costa, General Secretary of the G7 Plus Secretariat. I'm going to come back to you. I see there's a number of questions already coming in for you, sir, but we'll hold off on that because I'd like to go to our second panelist. Now, the world's largest humanitarian crisis is in Yemen, and it's entering its 7th year. With the human and economic costs of this continuing conflict and the COVID-19 pandemic combining to cripple the country. Now, even before the conflict in Yemen that has killed tens of thousands of people, only 2/3 of citizens there had access to the public electricity grid. And the conflict has destroyed hospitals, it's destroyed businesses, it's destroyed electricity plants amid fuel shortages as well. So many more now have to work by candlelight, and access to reliable electricity is just one of the many necessities people in Yemen are living without. The World Bank assessment shows that no public electricity is available in a handful of cities in Yemen, and almost none in the largest city, Sana'a, home to 2 million people. Ms. Afra Al-Zuba, you are there. You advise the Prime Minister of Yemen on humanitarian affairs. Can you paint a picture of just how urgent the need is for energy investment in Yemen? I know your camera is not working, but we'll be able to hear you. Go ahead. I think you'll have to unmute yourself. I see that you're on mute. If you could just unmute yourself, please. No, we're not. I don't think we're hearing her. I think she's on mute, or there might be something wrong with her connection. If we don't get her back in a few seconds, then I think I might go back to my first.
Thank you so much for inviting me for this platform. Yes. Yes.
Yes.
Yes, I did. Do you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me clearly? I think there might be a delay in the connection, perhaps. Can you say some words, please, Ms. Al-Zuba, so that we can hear if your connection is okay?
Yes.
Okay, go ahead. You have 5 minutes. Yes, go ahead. Go ahead.
Yes,
you have 5 minutes.
Yes, I'm hearing you. It's just because I think it takes time for my voice to reach you. Yes, exactly. There is delay. Yes, yes, yes.
Okay, quite a delay.
I did.
Okay, please go ahead.
Okay, I would. Yes, 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 sure, sure. So we are preparing a very quick presentation about scaling up the renewable energy investments in conflict-affected countries, and Yemen as a case. First of all, the status of the electricity supply in Yemen. Key indicators, as you just mentioned, some of the indicators prior to the conflict, only 40% of the Yemeni population had access to the public grid. Rural areas representing 75% of population, but around 23% had access to electricity and other, indicators. During the conflict, we have some of the indicators. Around 90% of population lack access to public electricity. We have produced so far 5 megawatts of solar PV were installed in 2017. There is also a problem with the fuel. There is a fuel crisis. Second slide or third slide, please. Yes. So in this slide, we can say that the solar energy penetration in Yemen during the conflict erupted late 2014, early 2015, and we can see the percentage, the curve went up, and it was very clear. Here in the graph, the main source of electricity for households in 2018, we can say that solar home systems 75%, and this is very encouraging in our situation. We can say this, although there are also huge percentage of population is still out of coverage of the service. But when we come to those who receive or who utilize the electricity, we can say the largest part is for the solar home systems. We can see here the other graph is related to the governor rates and the highest governor rates in consumption or utilization of solar energy. Next, please. There is also positive impact of the solar energy applications in Yemen. You can say the first photo is for the Al Jumhuriya Hospital, and it's one of the biggest hospitals. And you can say the station, the solar energy station, and we have different areas of improvement of public services provision, increasing food security, helping fulfilling the electrical needs in the households, create considerable number of jobs, reduce the greenhouse gas emissions. So these are the impacts that we already see in Yemen. Next, please. Next slide, please. Yes, in this slide, we can see the key challenges facing solar energy sector in Yemen: lack of regulations and supporting policies, high upfront costs is needed, especially in storage for storage systems, a lack of financial mechanisms and incentives, low purchasing power, which lead many people to purchase fake and poor quality products, and this is, we can tell stories about it, lack of product standards and market surveillance. The market is not attractive for investing in utility scale projects because of the high risk due to the conflict. And finally, lack of the awareness and the skilled laborers. So these are the challenging factors. Next, please. So the question of this panel, green energy matters in conflict-affected countries because the key elements for the social and economical development, it's of course environmentally friendly energy, less expensive source of energy, and more feasible compared to the conventional energy sources, best solutions for scattered rural areas, especially for Yemen, a country like Yemen, located far the national grids that need huge investment to expand the grids amid the financial constraints in the governments. Reliable and sustainable energy source and does not require much time to be installed, and mitigating the pandemic effect through powering healthcare facilities, sorting vaccines, and enabling communications while maintaining social distancing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Afra Al-Zuba, Prime Minister Advisor for Humanitarian Affairs in the Office of the Prime Minister.
Was it fine? Was it
of
clear?
Yemen.
Hopefully
That's
it is clear. So
absolutely clear. If you could now mute, then we'll go now to the question
one
and answer.
One of the problems in the communication.
Okay, thank you. She's been muted. Thank you. I'll come back to her in a minute, but I think there are a number of questions coming in. And as I said earlier at the beginning of this session, please do not be shy. This is an interactive session. The whole purpose of these development dialogues is to have a dialogue with you. So please bring your questions and let's put the questions to these esteemed panelists that we have today. We've got some here, but I think I'm going to actually start with one that I have and then move on to the ones that have come in. Mr. Helder da Costa, you are the General Secretary of the G7 Plus Secretariat. So it's apparent, sir, that we need to scale up investment and we need to scale it up fast. How do you see that happening? So what's needed from the international community? And I think more specifically, I'd like to know how UNDP can support governments of fragile states to develop regulatory frameworks to support energy investments and also to commit to transparency and the rule of law, something that is in the letter, the powerful letter that you put together. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you, Mark. There is no right path in among the G7 plus countries. Everything depends on the local country-specific needs. But what we try to articulate in our call to action, we call for our international donors and multilateral institutions to put together your resources, maybe in a trust fund, to be able to help those countries investing in energy sector or alternative renewable energy sector in fragile states. That's one. Secondly, what UNDP could do, I know that UNDP has done immensely, a lot of things that UNDP has done with different governments, with partner governments in many fragile states. One thing that I'd like to encourage the UNDP to continue to do is to empower the national governments to invest in energy, to provide a regulatory framework, to work with the legislator, with the executive branch, in order to be able to invest heavily in energy and alternative energy in fragile states. That's one. Secondly, we also call for our international donors, and as I mentioned earlier in my first point, I know that like DFID and many other Western European government agencies, and you have the power through the G7 group of industrialized countries and the European Union and others to come together and talk to your partners. Maybe you can set up time. It's about time for us to set up a trust fund, a global trust fund to invest in fragile states. That's the kind of practical, concrete suggestions that we put forward in our spirit of call to action.
Now, a big challenge, of course, sir, is ramping up ramping up green energy, I guess, is in a fragile context, is skills. I think about my own country, Nigeria, in terms of our epileptic power, electricity power that I lived through as a child. We called it blackouts and so on. How do governments in fragile states, how do they develop the skills, skills that can, from a regulatory perspective, that can, local capacity can be built up? How do you support that?
Yes, I can give an example. For example, in Guinea-Bissau, in Timor-Leste, in Sierra Leone, Liberia, in Democratic Republic of Congo, and you name it, in many countries. This frequent disruption of power is an acute problem in those countries. Yeah. So what can government do is to reach out to development partners who operate in those countries and ask them for their help to upskill the technicians, the local electricians, and so on, in order to be able to fix the interruption. But the problem is not only technical or skills. The problem is about the supply of fuel, supply of energy coming from the neighboring countries or from within the countries themselves. These are again adding to another complicated problem that those countries have faced already. So but the main thing here is that how do we invest in order for fragile countries to have access and to provide enabling environment to have access, electricity access to those people. And if those who are living in the rural areas, I know that the government, for example, in my home country, Timor-Leste, is now trying to its best to electrify 75% of its total population, whereas the other one, they're still trying to do it, but alternative means of energy also are on the table. For example, using the solar power and green wind power and so on. Those are the options that are on the table right now.
Thank you, Mr. Da Costa. I'm going to come back to you in a minute because there are a few more questions coming in, but I'm going to try if we can, to go to Ms. Al-Zuba. Apologies for those watching, but I think Ms. Al-Zuba has something like a 15-second delay in her answer, so it's a bit of a sort of a clunky to and fro, but I'll hope that we'll just be patient and wait for my words to get to her and her words to get to us. So this is my question for you, Ms. Afra Al-Zuba. You know, we read amid the despair that's engulfing Yemen, that there is a silver lining emerging, that solar power grids have started appearing on the roofs and houses in cities and villages. There's one incredible case of some entrepreneurs, 10 women who built and now run their own solar microgrid business in the Abs district, and it's bringing light and hope to their communities. It's an award-winning UNDP supported project, and we know these initiatives work, but there are still too few of them. How can these amazingly resourceful citizens, like these 10 women in Abs, how can they be supported to do more?
Sorry, could you please repeat that question?
Okay, my question is, I said that we're
speaking
reading
about, yes, please.
Yes, we've read about some incredible cases of entrepreneurs, 10 women who built and now run their own solar microgrid business in the Abs district, and they brought light and hope to communities. It's an incredible story. I encourage everybody who's watching to read up on this. It's won awards and it's been supported by UNDP. It works. We know it works, but how can we see more of this? There are too few examples. How can these resourceful citizens be supported to do more?
Yes, you know that the solar energy utilization in Yemen, it's booming. You know, after the conflict in many areas, because they couldn't find any other solution. It was the only solution that they have seen. So this is one very important point to be taken in consideration. The second thing is that there was also in the market, at the same time, there were some private sector investing in this area, and this is also was other factor. But there was also some problems in the quality of the materials that have been imported to the country. So some drop out of this experience happened. So this is from one side. The support that UNDP provided and other organizations provided to the solar energy for citizens, for households, and also for some facilities was also a good start that we are looking forward to build on. How can we support those initiatives? I think the factors that we already mentioned in the presentation. So we need more financial schemes can be provided to either to individuals, to households, to organizations, civil society who can contribute to these systems. And other thing, capacity building in terms of maintenance, in terms of preserving these solar systems. And the third one is maybe we need to talk also about some administrative issues related to how can we manage, how can we make some if we are speaking about small grids on that are targeting some communities. How can we organize these grids to get some financial benefit or fees that can sustain and expand the experience beyond that what's going right now?
Thank you for that. Very interesting response there. I'll go back to Mr. Da Costa for this one, and also Ms. Al-Zuba, if you want to weigh in afterwards, please do. This question comes to us through the chat, and it says, how do we balance and prioritize between investments in large-scale national energy infrastructure versus community-level off-grid renewable energy projects? How do we balance those two? Go ahead, Mr. Costa.
Thank you. That's a very difficult question. I have to admit that. Yeah, it's not up to us to say yes. You need to do this. It is up to the national governments themselves. I know that many national governments in fragile states, including the UNDP+ group, have competing priorities, as you can imagine, from A to Z. So it's very hard to say do we have the right balance here. But as a matter of principle, is that energy is a must, is an investment that has to happen if we want to attract investors to come and invest in fragile states. That's number one. So that means that investment in energy, electrification, electrical grid, and so on, that has to happen. And in fact, it does happen. Of course, the challenge in terms of setting this up is huge, it's paramount. Now, the second part of Rachel's question about do we need to invest in local community? Yes, that's why the government and the local community have this constant dialogue. Which way do we need? Do we have to invest in bottom-up approach or the top-down approach? This is where the dialogue happens at the national level. And I would like to urge that the development partners work together with the national governments under the spirit of the New Deal of engagement in fragile states, where you put the owners of development country-led development initiatives are in the hands of the national governments. So that's perhaps the wise answer that I could give you at this point in time. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Da Costa. I would like to go back to Ms. Al-Zuba on that same question, because you've just really articulated very well this illustration of a community-led off-grid project, which is capturing the attention, winning awards, and being covered by Al Jazeera. And then you have these ambitions to invest in large-scale national green energy infrastructure. But is there enough finance and opportunity to advance both agendas? How does it work? I mean, this is a real question for you in Yemen, I suppose.
Yes, this is very important and challenging question. In Yemen situation right now, we are hanging between fragile and conflict and post-conflict. The country, you can't give it one definition. So attracting huge investments in solar energy on national level, it's challenging, and I think it's not feasible, at least in this stage of the country situation. But we have to explore it, and we have to explore different possibilities. Either to talk about maybe to start with communities and off-grid areas. This can be a possibility, and especially we have like 75% of our population are left there in the rural areas. So this can be, and it's safer. It is safer than the cities. But the issue there is how much return the investors or the private sector can get if we start to build this small or community-based or rural-based schemes. This is very important to be considered. And for countries after conflict or post-conflict or fragile states, from my point of view, I think one very important thing is also to give some focus for cities, main cities, because usually the fragility reflected from the main cities, where the attention, the media, the big businesses, the states institutions are there. So also we have to find some innovative ideas. How can we embed or implement solar schemes in such areas. Again, maybe we can not have big scale, projects, but maybe zones or areas, neighborhoods. I don't know. I'm not, to be honest, I'm not specialized in this area, but again, I'm thinking, I'm trying to read the current situation in the country in terms of political situation, security, and also the how much the investors or the private sector can invest and ensure that they will get what they are looking for in terms of benefit and safety and security for their investments. So, but again, it's in the table for discussion, for negotiations, and for exploring different possibilities. For the time being, what's being done here in Yemen, again, we have this coverage for the facilities, health facilities, educational facilities, policing stations, public areas like streets, like these projects already run. And we have also the private, households levels where people are also seeking, to be connected to solar energy. It used to be in some parts of the country, and now these days I say also shift. The experience already expanded in all over the country, although it has some shortages. As I mentioned in my previous answer, shortages related to technical issues related to the quality of the solar system units, the quality of the plates, the quality of batteries, and also the quality of the technical people who usually responsible for the maintenance of these systems. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. You make a very good point there about the private sector and encouraging private investors because that's a critical part of the equation. But these are very choppy waters for international investors, from currency fluctuations to commodity price volatility. There's very little appetite in these COVID times for risk, and there's been a flight to safe havens of capital. So I guess, Mr. Da Costa, this may be a tough question to ask you, but anything you can add would be most welcome. How can we encourage international investors? But how can we create financial instruments and guarantees that would encourage investors to take a chance on green energy investments in fragile countries?
Well, if you want to know the secret of attracting the investors to come to fragile states, we need to sell our country's resource, not to sell, to promote the resource, the natural beauty, and the potential that the countries in G7 Plus possess. And we know very well that our countries possess an abundant natural resources, and that in itself attract already a number of investors. The only challenge, though, is that the regulatory environment, the political environment, the security conditions that preclude those investors to come because of the perceived high risk in fragile states. That is a fact, but we are working on it. Second point, how do we attract the investors to come to invest in particular the energy sector? Well, if I can give you an illustration, my own country, Timor-Leste, when we try to bring the Chinese investors to come and invest, because the Chinese are so entrepreneurial in Africa and elsewhere, including my country in Asia Pacific. After they come to visit the country in the rural areas, they go back and they say this to the Prime Minister. There are three things that you can do, Prime Minister, in order to be able to attract the foreign investors to come. First, you need to have an electricity, power, energy in the country. Second, you need to have a good road network. And the third, you have to have a telecommunication nowadays because of the power, internet, and so on. So those are the three things that we share these lessons from those comments from the Chinese investors to our fellow G7 Plus countries, that if you want to attract people, at least those are minimal conditions in order to be able to help lure the investors to come to invest in our countries.
Thank you. Perhaps, I don't know if that is a question for Afra Al-Zuba. Actually, I have another sort of more broader question to round up. I think we might be running out of time here, but Ms. Al-Zuba, do you think there's been enough response from international partners? You're probably going to say no to that question. And so maybe you can tell us some ways that international partners can do more to help in this regard. Oh, we might have lost her there. I think we might have lost her. She seems to have disappeared. Okay, I think we might just round up then in that case. I was going to ask you a question, Mr. Da Costa. I don't know if I have enough time. It was about data, actually. I don't know if that's something you can weigh in. Data is so very important. We haven't really talked about data, which is really important, especially with the fourth industrial revolution coming and this digital economy. How much should data play a part in solving this problem of energy poverty and also increasing investment?
I couldn't agree with you further on this. Data is crucial. That's why our call, we also ask for people to invest in research, in collection of data, in order to provide information to have a better informed policy decision making. Yeah, so that's we recognize there is a huge gap in terms of data collection in fragile states. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we might have lost our second guest there, but if you can still hear me, I want to say thank you to both of you for kicking us off there with an excellent first panel. And before there, she's back with us. Before I go, I want to just, on behalf of all of us, say thank you to the G7 Plus for stepping up with such a robust and clear clarion call for something that is very necessary in these times. And I hope that everyone that's listening here will get behind you in solidarity, because I think that the main thing is partnership and collaboration. I think that's what's really important, because one side cannot do it. We can only do it together. So thank you very much, Helder da Costa, and thank you, Afra Al-Zuba, for kicking us off with that first panel. Now we're going to go to the second session now, if I could. And the second panel is the question. Now, the open letter that asks that question about how we could do more is a rally to the public and private sector and development partners. And it points out that many fragile states have significant renewable energy resources that are far from being exploited. However, financial commitments in off-grid solutions in countries with the largest energy gaps, of which several are fragile, remain staggeringly low. Just 1.1% of the total finance for electricity investment, only $460 million globally, went to fragile states in 2018. That's the focus of our second panel, which asks the simple question: what do we need to do differently to scale up green energy in fragile context? What do we need to do differently to scale up green energy in fragile context? Now, panelist number one is Mr. Rafat Al-Khali. He is the convener of the Council on State Fragility. The council is co-chaired by former UK Prime Minister David Cameron, former Liberian President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, Nobel Peace Prize winner as well, and former President of the African Development Bank, Donald Kaberuka, and the G7 Plus. Sir, can you hear me? If you can hear me, just say hello, Mr. Al-Khali.
Yes, I can hear you, Mark.
Perfect, can hear you loud and clear. Now, so the Council led the call for action, urging foreign aid donors and private companies to ramp up investment in clean energy to break this, I guess, cycle of poverty in fragile states. Could you, just in 5 minutes, as sort of your opening gambit, tell us the significance of this powerful call to action, and also give us your thoughts on what we need to do differently to scale up green investments?
Thanks, Mark, and thanks to the speakers as well who kicked us off in the first panel. And it was a real pleasure to work with the G7 Plus and to thank them as well for their leadership on this a very important issue and very important sector. And in our collaboration with the G7 Plus on this call to action, the key point was that there is a need. We felt that there is a great need for a paradigm shift. We, as a Council on State Fragility, are solely focused on supporting and addressing the issue of state fragility, because we believe that is the core issue of our times. And unless we are successful in addressing state fragility, the world will not be able to achieve any of the Sustainable Development Goals, because mostly, as you correctly mentioned, poverty is increasingly concentrated in fragile and conflict-affected states, and we will soon have the vast majority of poor people concentrated in such contexts. And so if we do not take the realities into account of these countries who are affected by state fragility, we will not be able to address poverty. We will not be able to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. So that's overall. But we also realize that we do need a paradigm shift. We need a paradigm shift specifically in this energy area, to say that the energy sector is a priority. It unlocks many, if not all, other sectors. It addresses all the issues, or it unlocks or enables countries to address all of the other challenges there. And it tends to be not forgotten, but kind of relegated to a second order, given, of course, the vast challenges that face fragile and conflict-affected states. So it's not the sector that comes into mind for many development agencies, for example, in operating in fragile and conflict-affected states. Usually, there's more focus on the humanitarian, for example, support, or other areas of support. So we wanted to say there is a need to pay attention to the energy sector. The stepping stones out of fragility comes from creating economic growth in the country, generating jobs. That is the only sustainable and effective way of really getting out of fragility. And you cannot create jobs, you cannot get a functioning economy without energy. It's one of the basic components. So that's the first paradigm shift that is required. The second is to look more closely at distributed renewable energy. So typically, the focus is usually on large, central, grid-connected investments. But we have found through evidence and from research evidence that distributed and renewable energy is perhaps more suited or should be given more attention in fragile and conflict-affected states, because it addresses a lot of the challenges there. The addresses of the challenges of uncertainty. If you go for a large investment in a centrally connected grid, typically, that requires longer time horizons in countries that perhaps that certainty for investors is not there. Also, if you look at issues of capacity required, issues of levels of finances required, we felt that there is now an opportune time to put more focus on distributed renewable energy and ensure that there is enough attention there. The third area of shift that is required is to work on much better public-private partnerships in this sector specifically, both nationally and internationally. We feel that that needs to happen much earlier in the process than typical, because the private sector has a lot to bring to the table, not only in terms of investments, but also in terms of knowledge and know-how of how to make this happen. So governments need to be in the driver's seat. They need to make it a priority, this sector. They need to ensure a favorable regulatory environment is in place. The private sector needs to also step up and be willing to take that risk, supported by, and this is the important point I want to conclude with in terms of the role for the donor community and development agencies. This is where their role really comes in. And especially, development finance institutions have a key role to play in supporting private investors, providing enough insurances as well to cover political risk insurance and other types of risks that are abound in fragile and conflict-affected states. So really, multiple stakeholders and players have to come together to make this work, and we've tried to define a lot of these steps in the call to action that we've launched.
Thank you, Rafat. That was an excellent 5 minutes there. Much to chew on, but I'll come back to you in a minute. I'll go to our second panelist now, who is Mr. Daniel Scroff. Now, Daniel is the acting director for the Department of Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency at the African Development Bank, AFDB. And now, prior to joining AFDB, Daniel spent several years working for the European Commission and the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development in London. Daniel, welcome. Now, AFDB has for years, I guess, shown its commitment to Africa going green. For example, AFDB's Sustainable Energy Fund for Africa, SEFA, comes to mind. It's been providing finance to unlock private sector investments in renewable energy and energy efficiency across the continent. So tell us more about what AFDB is doing to scale up green energy in fragile states.
Thank you very much, Mark, and also thank you to UNDP for associating us to this important event, and I think a very pertinent topic. As Rafat aptly highlighted, there is clearly a high correlation between access to electricity and fragility, and energy is a critical development enabler. As Ban Ki-moon, the former UN Secretary General, so aptly coined it, energy is the golden thread that connects everything. Clearly, COVID-19 has exacerbated the situation. I think we've now seen for the first time in the last couple of years, as a result of COVID-19, that the people without access to electricity have increased in Africa last year. This is, of course, an unsustainable situation, and we need to increase our efforts to address this very systematically, particularly in fragile countries. The African Development Bank, you pointed it out, we've placed energy at the very top of our development agenda for the continent. It's the first of our so-called high fives for Africa, and particularly a focus on green energy. So since we launched our strategy in 2016, we have been investing primarily in renewable energy projects. More than 80% of our investments in generation have been in renewables. We've also placed a very strong focus on the decentralized energy solutions, which really need to complement investments in the grid. So it's not an either or, it's really a both that need to be pursued very actively. Let me just highlight 5 points very quickly that I think are important in response to the question of how do we do things differently to scale up green energy in fragile settings. First is, I think there's a critical priority on the energy planning side. Many of these countries have some of the highest costs of electricity, and that is in part due also to poor planning. So we need to look into least cost generation plans, integrated energy access plans that analyze what is the most rational solution for providing access to electricity depending on the specific characteristics. Is it extending the grid? Are there opportunities for mini grids, or is it indeed individual solar home systems that are the best and least cost solution? So that's the first one. The second one, it's critical that we move away from an approach of going from one pilot project to another. We need to find ways to scale and to bundle into larger programmatic approaches, both for the grid-connected space, where there are already ongoing, including in fragile countries, auction processes for independent power producers, but also on the decentralized space. We're working currently, for example, with the Democratic Republic of Congo on the first large pre-mini-grid tender auction program, which had to be prepared with a lot of support from different stakeholders. And we've assembled now a blended finance package with resources from the bank, with resources from the Green Climate Fund that we were able to mobilize, and also resources that we want to bring in from our Sustainable Energy Fund for Africa, SEFA, to which you referred just earlier. The third aspect I want to highlight is really we need to scale up facilities, funds that are already delivering in that space and target them more towards fragile countries. You mentioned SEFA. SEFA has been expanded 1.5 years ago from just a technical assistance facility into a larger blended finance facility that is now able to provide concessional loans, taking junior equity position in new innovative funding structures, and of course also providing grants where they're still justified and necessary. And we have also increased with that transformation our focus on fragile states. We had 15% of investments in fragile states before the transformation. Since then, based on last year's approvals and this year's pipeline, we're looking at over 40% of investments in fragile states. So that is clearly the direction to take. The third one, just to quickly highlight, we also need to do more in terms of complementing the different financial tools that are required to scale up energy access in fragile settings. And here I'm thinking about result-based financing that is really critical to close the viability gap that we're still seeing, particularly in the context of mini-grids. Equally, we need to look in the mini-grid space is how can we address the demand risk, which is one of the biggest challenges for investors. So one of the things we're currently working on is a minimum revenue guarantee that would kind of take care, at least to some extent, of this particular aspect. Fourth, I think we need to look more broadly into integrated projects, not just energy projects, but also projects that look at the nexus to agriculture, health, and other sectors, really focusing on productive uses. And last but not least, and I conclude on this, I think it's critical that also the various development partners, donors, coordinate better, really have integrated approaches, joint efforts to also reduce the transaction cost or the absorption cost on the side of many of these countries. And particularly if a donor comes one day, next day another donor comes, that clearly increases the transaction cost unnecessarily. Let me stop here.
Thank you, Daniel. That was very interesting. I already have a question for you that's come in, but I will go to the third and final speaker. Morten Blomqvist is the Chief Advisor at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Denmark. His job there is to drive Denmark's engagement in closing the energy access gap in Africa. Morten's also currently the chair of the board of directors of the Nordic Development Fund, which focuses on the space between climate change and development in lower income countries and countries in fragile situations. He's got quite a colorful resume. He was once lead advisor to Ørsted, the largest developer of offshore wind power in the world. And he's also worked for the World Bank, and he's also worked for Oxfam as well. Morten, you're very welcome. Can you, in 5 minutes, tell us how urgent it is to scale up green energy in the fragile context? And more importantly, how can we move from words to actions?
Thank you, Mark. It's very good questions. And I think the previous presentations have really provided constructive solutions. You can really be devastated by the numbers, looking at COVID-19 really slowing pace down and progress, and just looking at population growth, where the energy access at the end is almost eaten up by the growth of populations. And I think in this meeting here, I think we've all focused on the opportunities, looking on both lower prices on renewable technology really coming out. I mean, just in 5 years, 10 years time, solar energy has been, prices on solar energy and solar PVs has reduced by 80%, battery prices the same. It really opens up new opportunities that we could hear in Yemen. And I think that really is something that we need to focus on together, of course, with how do we actually mobilize private financing, which is really difficult part, and then looking at end users subsidies to close really the affordability gap that we see in many of these countries here. So just to, before zooming in on 3 specific areas, just to highlight as Denmark, I mean, we're one of the few countries providing our 0.7% of GNI, and also really trying to target both fragile countries and low-income countries in our strategy, and in delivering on the agreements in the international agenda. And by doing so, we are providing funding, but it's scarce. I mean, development assistance will not deliver everything. So we need to be catalytic in our thinking. How can we really make use of this scarce grant funding that is available in the market, and of course also looking into how much we can actually spend on this catalytic financing and development assistance in fragile countries. We need to spend more in these countries. That's definitely to sure in the future. But zooming in on three specific areas, then on the first hand, I mean, development finance need to be catalytic. We need to really look into how can we actually leverage blended finance with development assistance. I mean, it can be first loss guarantees. It can be how can we engage with impact bonds or others, more high risk investors that are looking into impacts as well in these type of context when we need to do this. And then also, I mean, how can we, on the second point, how can we actually design the programs in the future? And a lot of innovative business models are coming up. I think several have been mentioned already. I mean, results-based payment as one of the ways forward to really provide financing as kind of a subsidy or end user subsidy or subsidies to companies willing to take the risk in some of these countries. That could be a way forward. And then of course the off-grid business. I mean, so many new ideas and innovative business models are coming up. You mentioned yourself earlier Yemen and the case of a women-led initiative building off-grid energy supply in their neighborhood. Another example I came across very recently with the Nordic Development Fund was a project called Jasa Energy in Tanzania, providing batteries and how you can actually use a battery swap model that is even cheaper. I mean, they ask for $1 down payment to start up in the project, and then after that, then the day-to-day use of it is lower than the average payment for kerosene in the area. So I think there's so many innovative ways, but at the same time, we need scale now. It's not enough to pilot anymore. We need to scale up, and I think we do have a lot of the experience that we need as well. And then finally, and my third point is as Daniel highlighted, we need to bring more integrated view on energy access. Energy is costly, but it's also key to a lot of other development targets, both within agriculture, health care, education, as well as water management. I mean, we need to see this as an enabler for others, and that can also be a way of attracting and finding more resources and also grant funding for actually providing energy access to more people in the future. Then as kind of a final point, then we have the innovative models. We have lower prices on renewable technology, but I mean, really to attract private investors, then we also need to have capable institutions that can support this. We have to find out well-designed policy frameworks, and then finally also have a push towards the international investor community to take more risk. I mean, it's a dialogue that we need to take. I mean, in Denmark, we have a lot of the pension funds in Denmark. We have a close dialogue. I mean, they're not there yet to take these high-risk investment yet, but maybe slowly we can have this discussion as a new type of investment is coming up. And then finally, just as Denmark and how we're designing, I mean, we are one of the key supporters of CEFA, for instance, but we're kind of merging in and mainly going through multilateral organizations with our contributions to avoid having a too decluttered investment community to reach out with. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Morten. Very interesting there. I really have three wise men here on energy, green energy investment in the crisis setting. Let's move on to the Q&A part of this session now. I see a number of questions that need to be answered on the issue of scaling up green investment in a crisis setting. Let me first go to Rafat Al-Khali of the Council of State Fragility. There's a question that came in twice here, Rafat, and I'm going to read it to you because two people effectively asked the same question in a different way. It says, In conflict-affected situations, how can we protect energy investments and ensure that these large-scale investments are not damaged or destroyed? What's the responsibility of the state to guarantee the security of said investments, of such investments? It sort of echoes another question that came in from Hugh Mackelman. He said at the end of the day, what donors are going to invest, which donors are going to invest hundreds of millions of dollars in national energy infrastructure that has a high chance of being destroyed in conflict? So effectively the same question. Obviously, this is the big elephant in the room for you. What are your thoughts on that?
So two points in response to that. The first is, as I mentioned, we need to think of models of energy planning that are more suitable for these very valid risks in fragile and conflict-affected states. So that is why, as I mentioned, putting more thinking and more investments into distributed energy is a better way to handle this, because what happens, and I can give the example of Yemen, for example, where I'm from, when there is a central generation plant which feeds 50% or more of the country, it becomes a single point of failure and becomes an easy target for as soon as conflict erupts, that's what happens, or any damage to the central grid, for example. But with distributed systems, you would have much more resilience built into your power system already, which addresses some of these challenges. It also addresses the issue of usually people who attack or damage power infrastructure is because it usually does not feed into their immediate community. For example, there are many areas in different countries where the central grid goes over their heads, but they don't have electricity in their village or in their city. And so it becomes, again, an easy target. But with distributed systems, they would be really damaging themselves if they start attacking infrastructure in their area. So that's one thing, is to rethink the design. The other thing is what I mentioned, this need for much higher levels of political risk insurance. And this is an area, and other risk insurance. This is an area where it's lagging behind. We don't have enough of these types of insurance. We don't have, for example, media is the key actor here from the aid sector, let's say. But there could be much more done in order to mobilize more guarantees and more insurances in this field, which would protect against exactly these types of risks, which are very relevant there. The third point I want to highlight is I don't think we should look at this as donors putting hundreds of millions into these sectors. As was just mentioned, we are talking more about any donor money or grant money being catalytic for actual private sector investments. This is where the opportunity is. Private sector is looking for investment into these areas. There's a lot of funds available, whether it's pension funds, as was mentioned, or other types of investments, which could get a lot of good return if all the other factors are taken into account, if the insurances are in place, if the regulatory environment is in place. So I think we should also balance that and not look at this as a strictly donor aid money, but really mobilizing private sector into this.
Thanks, Rafat. I'll go on to you, Daniel. There's a question for you, Daniel, for the African Development Bank. Daniel, the question goes like this. It says, considering the importance of PPPs, public-private partnerships, in advancing green energy solutions, FDI levels in fragile states remain very low. What is the role for donors, governments, and others in subsidizing or indeed de-risking FDI in fragile states? To what extent does this risk moral hazard? And is the diversion of scarce public funds to the private sector the right approach? Any thoughts?
Thank you very much for that question. Let me try to respond to this. There are clearly different roles. Governments need to provide the right enabling environment for more private sector investments. That is the point around planning, a clear strategy, a clear kind of political targets. But it's also the question around are the the policies, regulations in place that are required in some instances for private sector to come in with significant investment. So that's really the role of the public sector. And obviously there is support from various partners available to assist the public sector in fragile countries with strengthening the enabling environment. Donors really, this is where the catalytic resources, as was pointed out by previous speakers as well, need to come from. There is a need in fragile settings for the use, the scarce and the careful use of grant resources with a view to leverage more private sector investments. And obviously this needs to follow sort of some of the principles of blended finance, in particular the principle of minimum concessionality. So it's really not about giving more undue benefits to the private sector. It's really to unlock and enable the private sector to invest in the first instance. On our side, we are also trying to use some of these catalytic funds in blended finance structures to provide that first layer of first loss capital or junior equity. One example, we just invested through our Sustainable Energy Fund for Africa in the first fund in the clean cooking sector, another dimension that is often forgotten in Spark Plus. And this kind of concessional tranche is so critical to anchor other investors that are more commercially oriented, and those are the type of investors that we need to get into these type of settings. So these are just a few reflections on that question. A lot more that could be said, of course.
Okay, let me just turn to Morten Blomqvist, Chief Advisor of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs at Denmark. A question here for you. How do you see the role of UNDP and other multilateral agencies to support the scaling up of renewable energy investments in fragile states from your perspective as a donor?
I mean, I see particularly two important roles, and it will differ whether it's UNDP or the African Development Bank or other types of multilateral funds and agencies. But one is to really support bringing the policy frameworks and institutional capacity in place. That is critical. I mean, we've heard about the issue about the quality of solar home systems, for instance. I mean, having a level of what type of imported goods are coming in and set up within the national frameworks. It can be how are tariffs, how are that regulated, how is the private sector and public utilities combined. All these time needs to be sorted out to attract investors. And there the capacity and knowledge from the multilateral agencies are critical to provide technical assistance and analytical work here. On the other hand, it's also to test out the blended financing mechanisms. I mean, there's so many things you can do and blend together, and I think we can actually be even more innovative and highlight best practice and share that between countries in fragile situation or even conflict-affected situations. How is that blended finance? Do we need to provide both first loss guarantees or end-user subsidies together with guarantees, or how do we mix all this together in the best and most efficient way? Because we need to add some new layers to really attract private financing to the G7 plus context countries. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I want to put that question also to Rafat. Rafat, how do you think UNDP and others can support governments of fragile states to develop a regulatory framework that supports energy investments and also commits to transparency and the rule of law? This is something, the rule of law, this is something that specifically was stated in your powerful letter.
Absolutely, and I think that is the area that governments require most support in fragile and conflict-affected states, because governments don't necessarily, by instinct, know what would attract foreign investors, for example, what would make for the best, contracts and contractual obligations on both sides, how to protect the public interest as well and not be used by potentially bad investors, let's say. So all these areas, this is where I think UNDP and others can play a key role in supporting governments with that, because they can, when we work and we do a lot of work at the International Growth Center with different governments on regulatory frameworks, and kind of the question is always, okay, is there a simple, let's say, toolkit? And of course, nothing can be replicated, nothing can be just copy-pasted from other countries. But if there could be a toolkit of some sort where governments can better understand what does it mean to build a favorable regulatory framework, what are the different areas for that, what do they need to pay attention to, and how can they really promote themselves as a destination, and their countries as a destination for investors, because both local investors and international investors, and this is a key area as well in many of fragile and conflict-affected states. Local investors are typically the first ones to go in, given the high risk, given the high uncertainty, the very complex political situations. You find in a lot of times a few private sector investors from within the country, and the international architecture has to also help equally, not only foreign direct investors, but also local investors as well. And this is, I think, the key area where UNDP and others can play a big role in.
I want to come back to you and ask you about a specific country, but I'll hold off on that question, Rafat, and I think I'll go to Daniel. Daniel, you did or African Development Bank had an online dialogue recently. I think it was just in February or so. And as I recall, the UN Secretary General appealed for greater action to provide renewable energy to the hundreds of millions of Africans who still lack reliable and affordable energy. Now, Africa has only received 2% of global investment in renewable energy over the last decade. And his words, I'll read his words to you. He said, it is achievable, it's necessary, it's overdue, and it's smart. Climate action is a $3 trillion investment opportunity in Africa by 2030. And now, clearly, the old models of development and energy use have failed to give us light, or at least give light to all. So this is a difficult question, but with your pedigree, you're probably the best person to try to tackle it. What does a new model look like?
No, thank you very much. And first to say that I couldn't agree more with the UN Secretary General. Clearly, if we look at the amount of investment going into Africa, it is still minuscule compared to many other regions. Similarly, even on climate finance, only a fraction of climate finance globally is at the moment coming into African countries. And clearly there is a need to increase access to climate finance through some of the accredited entities with international climate institutions such as the Green Climate Fund, but also by increasing direct access for African countries to access some of those climate resources directly. That is quite essential. I think the second aspect is what certainly also investors are looking for is a programmatic approach. I give you a concrete example. We're working currently very closely with the G5 Sahel countries, which are all different stages of fragility on the Desert to Power initiative, which is really intended to seize the solar potential of the region and looking at it in a holistic way. So not just focusing on increasing on-grid solar generation capacity, but also focusing on the critical transmission infrastructure, on scaling up the distributed decentralized solutions through solar home systems and solar powered mini grids, but also addressing the situation of the utilities and the policy and regulatory framework. So this type of approach, I think, helps investors to get more clarity. So there is a high-level political commitment. We have an endorsement at the highest level from the heads of state of these countries. We've worked with the countries on Desert to Power roadmaps that really outline the targets, the priority actions that need to be undertaken, and also identified priority projects. And the third key priority that we're focusing on is on mobilizing the required resources, particularly for project preparation. One thing that we did not touch in this discussion this far is that if you look at fragile states, there are many project ideas, but very few projects are at the state that you can actually invest in. So project preparation is really essential. So we looked at in the Sahel G5 at in this context of more than 80 priority projects identified, and actually almost 3/4 of these projects do need project preparation support. So we need to also scale up that project preparation support to have more projects that are then ready to be investable from institutions such as ourselves, and more importantly, the private sector.
That's very true. Bankable project is what you're talking about. But before I go on to another question, I just wanted to ask you, have you found that when you're interacting with different governments across the 54 countries of Africa, that green infrastructure choices require more state involvement than non-green choices?
Well, I think what I've certainly noticed over the last couple of years is that I think across the continent there is a prioritization now of the potential for renewables. And that has really changed tremendously. Equally, there is a lot more recognition that it's not just about extending the grid. There are many other solutions that can complement that picture. So that has changed. I think there's still quite a number of African governments that believe that there's a need for fossil fuel-based solutions, particularly to address sort of baseload requirements. And I think this is where support from the international community can help to look into what alternatives exist. How can one combine different renewable energy solutions to provide an equivalent to baseload? How can the grids be strengthened to absorb and integrate more variable renewables? What happens when the sun does not shine? How can one use the potential of storage, for example? So this again requires, I think, in my view, also a frank conversation with governments, but also not only to say this is what we would suggest to invest in, but also this is the type of financial support that we can provide to have a cost-competitive package solution that addresses your needs.
Gentlemen, an open question here for you guys. This one is from Dr. Sadaldeen Talib, who is the former Minister of Industry and Trade for Yemen, who asks, or rather suggests, he says, can I suggest a revolving fund to finance off-grid rural agriculture or domestic green energy, solar, with very low or no interest? Does anybody want to comment on that suggestion? He's suggesting a revolving fund to finance off-grid rural agriculture or domestic green energy, solar. You guys are the experts. What do you think of that?
Well, I think the revolving nature is very important, and I think our tendencies now also, I mentioned the example of SEFA earlier, which was before just a facility providing straight grants for project preparation. Now it's more flexible, including really where it is not absolutely necessary for straight grants to have a reimbursable grant or a low interest concessional loan, because that helps also to bring the funds back into the overall fund and helps us to support more projects. So I think that is a perfectly pertinent suggestion. I think this is also, I think, the trend that we're seeing with many facilities now across not only Africa, but also in other continents.
Thank you for that response. Rafat, this question is for you. I said I was going to bring up a specific country, and that country is China. The question comes in from the chat box. It says, what role can or indeed should China play as the world's largest producer of renewable energy hardware in investing in green energy in many crisis contexts in Africa and places like that, where they are the biggest trading partner? What's your thoughts on that, Rafat?
I think that's, I mean, whether it's China or other countries, I mean, I think the direction is the same. The direction is we need to bring more private sector investors. We need to bring more guarantees and insurances and mechanisms that could catalyze and mobilize these private sector investors. And we need to work with governments to ensure that the regulatory framework is in place, as we said, and that this is a sustainable effort, and that we can grow it into a proper functioning sector. So I think these are kind of the three conditions, and China being a large player in this sector is definitely a key partner, I would say, to many countries in this field. Perhaps what maybe distinguishes China in their approach is that typically they are willing to take much higher risks in terms of the modalities that they work with, but at the same time it has its own or it comes with its own conditionalities as well, right? So I think it's definitely, whether it's China or others, I would say if the country, the government have a plan in place, easily donors, countries, partners, private sector will all come through. But the key thing is for the governments to step up and take the leadership role.
Okay, we're almost out of time. I think I have about 3 minutes or so. So what I'm going to do is ask you in 1 minute to just round up with your final thought. This panel's question was, what do we need to do differently to scale up green energy in fragile contexts? You've given us some very, very great interventions there. And I'm going to go in reverse order, and I'm going to start with Morten. Morten, you have 1 minute for your final thought.
Thank you. I think actually one of the last questions from Yemen about the off-grid power solutions for agriculture and domestic green energy, I think that's one of the way where, I mean, there's so many new solutions. I mean, not talking just about mini grids, but also microgrids and how it can be easily deployed with a container solution. And if you need more energy, then you can deploy more containers. I mean, there are a lot of solutions where you can scale up to the risk level as well, and with the financing levels as well, and at the same time then combine it with funds like CEFA, where you can actually also scale up and have the institutional capacity to scale up in a long-term perspective as well.
Okay, I'll now turn to Daniel Scroff, please, for your 1 minute.
Sure, very quickly, I think I would just highlight 3 points. One, we really need to scale up what is working and have larger programmatic approaches, moving a little bit away from one little project here and there, because that's not going to make the difference overall. Secondly, we need to synergize more. It's really a need to kind of link the various interventions of different partners to achieve maximum impact. And third, but certainly not last, is we need to speed up. We're already behind the track to achieve the Sustainable Development Goal number 7 by 2030. So speed is of the essence. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And finally, Rafat Al-Khali, convener of the Council on Staged Fragility.
Thanks, Mark. I'd say just that it's really critical to ensure that we continue the focus and the momentum. And thanks to UNDP for hosting this and ensuring that it continues to be on the agenda. I think the focus on fragile states, as I mentioned, is a priority. And the focus on energy in fragile states is a priority. And we have a number of key events coming up. You know, we have the G7 summit, we have the COP26, and we should not forget fragile states. It is different set of challenges, different set of issues, different set of realities in fragile states than the general developing world, let's say. So we need to ensure we continue that focus on it, and we continue the push for scaling up investments in energy and in renewable energy in fragile states.
I want to thank all 4 of you. Indeed, I want to thank all the panelists for what has been a very interesting 90 minutes. We're going to have to round this one up now. But before we do, I just want to say that one thing is clear. We definitely need to redouble our efforts to strengthen collaboration and partnership between the G7+, the UNDP, donors, and all stakeholders. Now, to articulate those thoughts and give us our closing call to action, I can turn to Marcel Allers. He is the Global Head of Energy for the United Nations Development Programme. So to close us out, Marcel, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mark. Yeah, thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to say a few words. to close out this discussion. It's going to be a bit of a challenge to, to outdo the very rich discussions that I just heard. A lot of things have been said that I wholeheartedly agree with, and we in UNDP in general. What I was struck by, I guess, is the level of convergence between the various speakers, right? There seems to be a growing consensus of the sort of direction where this needs to go. I heard very clearly stated by all the partners the very centrality of SDG 7, the importance of energy to human development and the connections to all the other SDGs. Not achieving SDG 7 is not an option because we will not be able to achieve many, if not most, of the other SDGs. I also hear clearly opportunity. It's not just problems that need to be solved, but they come with a huge opportunity, an upside, if you like. I heard the grid versus off-grid solutions, the increasing importance, in particular in off-grid setting, in fragile settings, sorry. A lot of that problem is not only, but is very concentrated in so-called off-grid rural areas. And there is this awareness, if you like, a shift in focus to go beyond just grid extension, but to give due attention to off-grid solutions, distributed solutions. Risk came up frequently, and of course, especially when you try to attract private investment, which is another stated goal by all the participants, panelists, and we fully agree with this. It's an energy, it's a capital-intensive sector, which requires essentially private sector participation. Otherwise, we're never going to get there. So risk also in terms of risk-taking, or rather the aversion of risk, which is still very common in the development community, in the donor community. I think Morten pointed it out. It's also us, UNDP. I mean, we all tend to be rather risk-averse, want to play it safe. I think there is a real need for calculated risk-taking, not squandering public money, but still, taking that first step. We heard about instruments like first loss guarantees, etc. Now, the issue of private sector involvement and investment and public-private partnership, again, frequently mentioned, fully agree with it. And there is what I would say there is that where development partners, like several of us on the panels, can come in is to really support governments to negotiate good deals, so to say, because they need that support. There's often limited capacity, and we're dealing with private companies that can be much more sophisticated. So it's important that the public interest gets protected. Now, the issue of capacity, frequently, I fully agree with this. There is still a lot to be done, institutional strengthening, and things like that. Donor coordination, we remain fairly fragmented. I would say it's getting better, but it's still an issue. And donors coming into countries not necessarily talking to each other, and that can lead to certain problems. Now, on the topic of market-based approaches, because this has been sort of a common theme throughout, this is sort of what is being proposed as best practice. So how do you bring in market-based approaches? And that's, of course, for a good reason. We want sustainable solutions that do not depend on drip feeding of continuous handouts. We agree with this, but I would also say, in particular in fragile context and rural communities, there is a limit to that, and we have to acknowledge this. We will not be able to reach all those that currently don't have access to electricity through market-based approaches. We will hit a barrier where simply there is no money. People can't afford it, even with all sorts of mitigating measures, etc. And so we need to think about that. I think Daniel referred to it through his, there's a need to look at the demand side. Are the subsidies perhaps needed? This is not a popular message. This is something the donors don't like to hear, but I would encourage us to take it on, because otherwise, what are we going to do with these very substantial number of people? The estimates are in the 100 million plus. We cannot just leave them behind. We got to find a solution for those cases too, and perhaps more with community-based models, etc. Scale comes up frequently. There is definitely a need for scale, more integrated approaches, the importance of, because energy is should be embedded in more broad-based development interventions as part of the solution. So less sectoral interventions, but particular, for example, nexus issues with the health sector, especially in the COVID situation, very, very relevant, of course, but also like agriculture. Productive uses. Use energy to drive productive use, create jobs, become an engine of growth and increased welfare of a local community. Now, so on the issue of, and then maybe a thing to say, I'm just reading my notes here, excuse me, is, maybe a few missing elements that didn't really come up. First, I would like to say, we talk about energy as if it's only electricity, but there are other energy uses that are critical to human survival. Heat, use energy for heat to cook, for example. I don't hear nothing about it, at cooking, people need to eat. People need to prepare meals. That is arguably even a more basic need that needs to be addressed through clean solutions. And I won't even go into all the health impacts of current ways, the way people cook. So I would like to encourage us to keep that open and talk about energy solutions more broadly that go beyond just electricity. Also, the role of gender. I was pleased to hear the advisor, the Prime Minister of Yemen, talk a little bit about it. But more broadly, I didn't hear enough about the role of women in this whole discussion, which is absolutely critical. And so I encourage all panelists to, in their work, to never forget that aspect either. Now, in terms of the use of scarce public resources, this is something that has been mentioned. We wholeheartedly agree with this. UNDP is very much using that same approach. And so what we typically do, UNDP, we have a presence in the energy area for many decades. We are very much on the ground. And so we feel like we can be a useful partner to governments to help address and reach those populations that are fragile, that are in difficult situations. And we're happy to continue doing this. And we heard some of the examples mentioned in Yemen, but in the Sahel, we're very active in the Democratic Republic of Congo and in many, just about any of the other countries. So we'll continue doing this. Now, our approach is often to provide more upstream support to governments and to help them. Something that has been mentioned frequently by all the panelists is the need to have these enabling conditions, basic policy and regulatory frameworks that are predictable, that are transparent, that are stable in the long run, that don't change from year to year. This is the kind of things that private sector looks for, that they need in order for them to invest. We're talking about long-lived assets. The typical lifespan of these investments is 20 plus years. And a lot of that investment has to happen right up front. It cannot easily be spread out over time. And so there is a serious risk. And that is one of the reasons why there is reluctance for private sector in the absence of those things, transparent long-term frameworks to engage. It's understandable. I think, looking at the time, maybe a few final points is, okay, I mean, I already talked about what UNDP is doing. Now, also for those that are interested, we today put a blog on our website on this whole topic. For those interested, please have a look. And then finally, what I would like to let the audience know that energy this year is very much in the spotlight. There's going to be a United Nations high-level dialogue on energy taking place in September at the margin of the General Assembly. And this is the first, and it's going to happen at summit level, heads of state. We're right now in a preparatory process leading up to an event, and several of the people on the call today are also involved in this. This is a significant event. This is the first time since 1981 that the United Nations convenes such a meeting. And the main reason is concern by the member states that we're simply falling behind on our commitment to meet the SDG 7 targets in access, but also in terms of greening the systems, increasing share of renewables, and increased energy efficiency. So there's only 9 years left, less even, until 2030. There is a real need to step up by all of us to really put our shoulder to the wheel, so to say, to find the solutions that are needed to scale things up. There's not a lot of time left. So over to you, Mark.
Thank you, Marcel. Marcel Allers, UNDP's Global Head of Energy there, giving us a nice précis of what's been a very stimulating 90 minutes. We've been discussing scaling up green energy investments in crisis settings. It's important to emphasize as we close here that UNDP signed up to the G7's call to action. And incidentally, UNDP also has a blog that I have to tell you about, which covers this topic and other topics about fragile context, supporting fragile context, energy poverty and fragile states and such. I encourage you to check it out and contribute to it. It's on the UNDP website. Now, the ultimate aim of UNDP's Development Dialogue series is to use this platform to rethink and rethink our approaches to combating crisis and fragility, and re-emphasize a people-centered approach to development, a bold new approach for a decade of action. We want to strengthen international community's global commitment to leave no one behind. Well, I'll be back again next week, Thursday, at the same time for another development dialogue. That one's going to be on finance, and the theme for that event is managing risks, supporting recovery and stability. Until then, I want to say thank you again for a stimulating dialogue, and thank you for joining in. Goodbye, and we'll see you next week.